So, of all the changes that we've been talking about this morning, perhaps the least predictable and the most disruptive is the future of work. And the level of both of those things are borne out by these kinds of stats that you often come across. You look at it and you think, you just made that up, didn't you? Actually, you just made that number up. You've got no idea. And the thing about stats, particularly when it comes to social forecasting, is most social forecasters use stats the way a drunk uses lampposts. It's for support, not illumination. But despite the fact that there's only really two kinds of forecasts, lucky or wrong, despite that, we shouldn't really dismiss stats like this, because we've only really got to look at the jobs that currently exist to see that 10 years ago they weren't around. Professional mermaids. There's hundreds of websites for professional mermaids. I had to look at them. It was part of the research, you know. But it's a growing industry. There's even a university course for professional mermaid. And they have a phrase now. It's called the mer industry. Dog surfing trainers, another growing field. And this one's my favorite. Professional foreigners. In China, this is a big deal for Brits. So if anybody's looking for a career change, you just go over to China, you just pretend boyfriend or CEO or diplomat, and they pay very handsomely. None of these jobs existed. So what I want to try and do in the time that we've got is to look at what I think are kind of four opposing futures. And sometimes these futures can kind of exist alongside one another. Other times they're kind of contradictory. But I think the thing to preface this by is to say that we are perhaps going through a period of massive upheaval in the way that we think about work, the way that we do work, the way that we consider work as an industry. And that's probably a good thing, because if you look at just recently, almost all of the jobs came in the last 5 years all the jobs that came up were for companies that have been less than 5 years old. So the responsibility for job creation is no longer with the big, well-established companies. And that's probably a good thing, because as Mark said earlier, we've got levels of employee engagement which are shockingly low, 13%. So it's not a bad thing that somebody else is having a crack at it. Okay, let's look at the first one. Paul Sappho, who is a social forecaster, said, figuring out what will replace the job is the greatest challenge of the next 30 years. And it's true. We're moving from jobs to contracts, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But nevertheless, there are still people who do a full-time job for a full-time salary for an employer. But if we look at just the current trends and recent history, you can see that the demand for work is changing significantly. So the non-routine cognitive skills are in greater and greater demand, as are the non-routine manual skills. The routine skills, there's no demand for it. And to go to something that Ed referred to earlier, with the exception of places like School 21, most of the time we're preparing kids for a future that just doesn't exist. We're giving them routine skills. It was Seymour Saracen, I think, the great American educator, who said the best way to prepare kids for the life beyond school is to put them in the life beyond school as often as possible. So there are still going to be jobs, but we are really, I guess, facing what could be deemed the elephant in the room. And we've already talked about this on a couple of occasions this morning. But it is having a massive, massive impact. And I think Jeff Bezos is right when he looks at this. When you look at the impact of automation, artificial intelligence, there seem to be two views. Although the first view, which is that we've got nothing to fear from that, only seems to be held by one person, this guy. Actually, when you think about it, his is probably one of those jobs you would like a robot to do. Couldn't do it any worse. But I think most of the time people like Stephen Hawking and Bill Gates, Elon Musk, conceive of the threats, really, behind automation. And it's this kind of image that we've got. It's slightly creepy when you look at what robots are capable of doing now. So that's kind of one oppositional future. And it is a measure, I think, of the way in which we've screwed up work, that actually you could look at robotics as saying, now I've got to find another source of income, or it could be this response, a robot took over my job, now I'm actually free to enjoy life. Nobody thinks of it like that. We all think of it in the former, that it's a threat. And it's partly because of the way that we've messed things up. So the other oppositional future is when we talk about underemployment. Some of you will be familiar with this phrase, some of you may not. It's essentially that increasingly we are training people to do work which they didn't need a degree for. So half of recent graduates, the so-called barista graduates that you hear about, are working in jobs where they don't need a degree and they're actually not doing as many hours as they'd like to do. Almost a fifth of the workforce is without a full-time job. And underemployment rates, I think, are now a much better kind of indicator of how we look at work than unemployment rates. And they're 3 times higher. So that there are 3 times as many people underemployed than there are unemployed rather. And part of this is this phenomenal rise that we've seen in 0 hours contracts. On the other hand, we've probably got a bigger skills gap now than we've ever had. These are the growth industries, and you can see that when employers are asked, are you getting the right skills coming through, larger and larger numbers are saying no. So we've got a number of tensions here. On the one hand, people are underemployed. On the other hand, we've not got the right kind of skills to do the jobs that we need for the future. So how do we fix it? Well, I'd like to suggest 3 things, really. The first is that we should make work more like learning and learning more like work. In other words, we know from research that when people feel as though they're learning and developing, they're curious, they're deeply engaged, and they will stay loyal to their company. But it astonishes me the relatively rare numbers of people who are like Gary Ridge at WD-40, who sees his job to create the kind of learning context. And of course, as I've already alluded to, we've got issues with our students who are not getting experience of the real world and not getting the kind of skills that Ed talked about earlier, which are these superpowers which are so important. So I think we've got to look at both of those areas, both the supply and the demand. But we've also got to consider that in this freelance future that we've got more and more young people who are in the position now of not necessarily needing to find work. They'd rather set up their own company. So the talent race is going to become more and more intense. And I think companies need to think about 4 things, really, when they're looking to see how can they attract top talent. The first is to create a sense of trust. Astonishing statistic, which I came across a couple of years ago, said that when they were asked, 45% of people said that in the last 12 months, their boss had thrown them under the bus to save their own skin. So we've got companies that are not being run on trust. But the other ingredient that we need to think about is autonomy. We've lost our permission to think. In the past 40 years, levels of autonomy within the workforce have halved in 40 years. And increasingly, people are being asked to work towards a script. And then mastery, this sense that Ed talked about craftsmanship. People need to feel like they're doing something that they're good at. And most of the time, they're not. So we have to recognize that people want to join a company because they're going to develop both personally and professionally. And then I guess the 4th thing, and this is a really big one, it seems to me, is that millennials are only going to work for companies that share their social and moral values. And this is an astonishing change when you think about it. My father grew up in the northeast of England, as you can probably gather, and my dad used to say to me, just get the job that pays you the most money, because you're never going to enjoy it. That was the advice that I got. And in 2 generations, we've now got millennials who are saying, I'd rather work for less money for a company whose values are really believed in. So I think these are the 4 kinds of things that we need to provide in the workforce. And the last thing is that we somehow have to break this link between labour and remuneration. In this country, even though we've got a pilot going on in Scotland right now, it's hard to get people to talk about a universal basic income. But we've got to accept the fact that despite all their best efforts, we're going to have some young people now who are just unable to get a proper paying job. And so long as we've got this link between labour and remuneration, that's going to create social tensions. So we have to think about universal basic income and who's going to pay for it. And in California, they're now starting to talk about robot taxes. Bill Gates is saying it's long overdue, we need to be doing it. And we need to be getting involved in those kinds of conversations. Because I believe that we are, as Mark said, we are approaching that kind of point at which it could get quite bloody if we're not careful. I'm amazed at the kind of optimism of most young people that I work with, given what a poor hand they've been dealt. I often say that baby boomers like me, we had the party, they've got the hangover. And I think we have to bear in mind that we're now living in this age of polarisation, where, truth is a kind of victim of fake news. Nobody wants to occupy the middle ground. And if we're not careful, we are going to reach a position with our young people where they've become embittered, they've become disillusioned, and we have to avoid that. We have to make sure that work is not, or the lack of work, is not a further cause of polarisation, because our young people deserve better than that. Thanks very much.